Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game SO. Today I got a very fun and very rare piece of hardware to show you today because we're going to be talking about the Konami Cobra. This is one of the most powerful arcade boards made in the late 90s. It is an absolute disaster that breaks if you look at it even the wrong way, and it has more chips on it than a family-sized bag of Lay's. But even if it's broken all the time and barely does anything whatsoever, it does have a Konami arcade fighting game, so you know I am hyper interested in it. And this board only ever ran two games, Fighting Bujutsu, also known as Fighting Wu-Shu 2nd, as well as a special version of Racing Jam. And even though it only ran two games and absolutely failed in arcades, it is some fun hardware to talk about. So we're going to be going over the entire board today, talking about what I'm trying to do to get this thing actually powered on and running, and just why the Konami Cobra is the absolute biggest dumpster fire of an arcade board anyone has ever made from the beginning of time. And I do love my Konami hardware, you know that when I talk about it on the channel, but the Konami Cobra is a mishmash of some of the strangest selection of parts I've ever seen, and this thing has not one, not two, not three, but four CPUs, as well as 7 different GPU chips. It is one of the biggest arcade boards I've ever seen, and this top 3 boards alone are just responsible for the actual code for the game, running the game in and of itself. I will show you the GPU board in just a bit. It is a massive hunk of steel and silicon, the likes of which you've never seen. But if we take this top board off, you're going to see just how large the middle board is going to be, and there really isn't even that much on it. It seems like Konami just developed a board for absolutely everything. This is going to have a PowerPC 403GA processor on it, and this is one of the 4 PowerPC processors you're going to see on board the Cobra. This is not a dual CPU, it is a quad CPU configuration, and the CPUs are littered all across the board. As far as what this game does, it is a JVS board, and it's going to be VGA 31 kHz out. The Konami Cobra is supposed to compete with the Sega Model 3 in arcades, giving you equal if not better power, because Konami wanted to rival the best of what was in the arcades at the time hardware-wise, and that was absolutely the Model 3. And Sega had Lockheed Martin's development help. Konami went alone on this one. And of course it wouldn't be a Konami arcade board if it didn't have a real-time clock chip with the security code to run the game on it. This one has one as well, but it's socketed, which is going to make my life a lot easier moving forward. And you will see it even has a massive unpopulated spot for an FPGA chip, so it seems like the Cobra was designed to be expandable in the future with more custom silicon on board, but of course that never happened because only 2 games ran on it, and then Konami retired it from use and moved on to new hardware because this thing was insanely expensive to make, and the games that were on it did not hit in arcades. They were not widely adopted, so Konami must have absolutely lost a bucket load of money on this. But for 1997, Fighting Bujutsu looks very good. This is getting close to something like Virtua Fighter 3 on the Model 3, and maybe half a step behind something like the Sega Dreamcast, but those models have an absolute ton of polygons on them. And if we move over to Soul Calibur on the Dreamcast, yes, this definitely looks a little bit better, but you can see just how powerful the Cobra was in actual usage. Now this is serial number 708089, but ignore the first 4 numbers. This is probably the 89th board they made. Normally with Konami, they don't do huge runs unless the games get big, and even though they gave a huge marketing push to the Konami Cobra platform as well as Fighting Bujutsu, it just failed in the market. Now this uses a hard drive, and that's the #1 failure point, but it's the easiest one to fix, and you do get the classic Konami 2-digit counter that's going to give you any sort of error codes out of the board. It's the same thing on the Konami NWK-TR. You'll get different error messages, but for the most part, especially for the rare hardware, you're never going to find a key as to what those numbers mean, so you kind of have to decipher it on your own, unfortunately. But let's pop underneath the main board and go to the subboard because it is even more densely populated than the actual main motherboard in and of itself. When I say Konami over-engineered this thing, it is an absolute understatement. They used every technology at their disposal from IBM and basically just made one of the most powerful arcade boards they could possibly come up with, and the engineering team really didn't do a great job of actually building it. You're going to see not 1 but 2 PowerPC processors on this board, bringing us to a total so far of 3 different CPUs, with the primary on this one being the 603 underneath that heatsink. I'm going to leave the heatsink on because it definitely seems to be a little bit brittle and stuck. I'll only remove it if I have to repaste it for the future in case this thing does overheat. And that's one of the biggest problems with this board is thermal and heat management. The boards will tend to warp and flex because Konami's engineers didn't do a good enough job dissipating the heat, and this PowerPC doesn't even have have any sort of heatsink on it. So if the board gets too hot and it flexes, you can pop or otherwise crack a ball grid array ball underneath any of the processors, and that is just one of the biggest problems with this. They did not make many of them whatsoever, and for the most part, every single one that sells, and in the last 5 years, that has been exactly one, has not worked due to these exact issues. This board is in progress of repair. I'm not powering it on in this video. I still have a lot of work to do, but I'll definitely do that for you guys. And you'll see here, of course, it has to come with at least one bodge wire, and it's pretty impressive they only had one bodge in here. And there is a secondary error counter as well, but it's underneath the entire board set, and in the cage you'd be able to absolutely not see this thing whatsoever. There's also a secondary test button here, but they put that little icon in a place where you could not read out the display whatsoever. Really makes you wonder what they were thinking. And as far as the bodge wire is concerned, it's just moving power to one other place on the PCB, so they must have actually missed that. So taking a look at the top PCB, this is going to have another power PC underneath the heatsink, which would again, it seems to be a little bit stuck, bringing it to a total of 4 different power PC chips on these boards, and that is just for running the game logic, the code, the sound, everything that isn't the visuals, because I haven't even gotten to the GPU board yet, which has a ton of chips on it as well. And this is obviously footage from main because it does technically work in there. And now you have your third error counter as well. It's almost like Konami planned on these things to break, and they were going to have technicians understand what was going wrong, because 3 different error counters mean that they're planning on showing you errors in 3 different boards. You also have a couple different FPGA chips, 1 socketed ROM, but for the most part all of the game code is going to function off that hard drive, and again that counter, but at least the first 2 you can actually see compared to the subboard, which would be completely undetectable unless you had some sort of weird mirror. Around the side here, you're going to find this ultra high density connector, and this is going to connect the main board and all of the different power PC chips, one that you can slightly see underneath there, to the actual GPU board in and of itself. And of course, it's just not the top of this board that's absolutely populated with everything. Underneath, there are probably 20 other chips and some capacitors keeping everything else running. And if any one of these components goes wrong, the game will not boot and it will not work. I hope you're starting to understand just how complicated this hardware truly is. And this is the GPU board right here. It uses IBM workstation chips, and it has 8 of them on board, as well as some other IBM customs and that high density connector, as well as other power connectors. This thing is the #1 fault point for Konami Cobra boards. This board gets exceedingly hot, the fans were not powerful enough, and those are passive coolers not having fans attached to them. But this board is why the Konami Cobra looks so good and could basically keep up with something like the Sega Model 3. They took IBM's best-in-class workstation chips to produce visuals and decided to throw them in an arcade board. Sega had Lockheed Martin, Namco had Evans and Sutherland, and Konami had IBM, which is somebody you don't see on the visual side very often in arcades. A lot of power PC processors on boards, but not much for the actual visuals. And the underside of this board is just insanely complex, maybe the most complex piece of arcade hardware from its generation as far as all the traces and pathing is concerned. You will see some components underneath here which are literally smaller than 1 piece of rice, and I will put a dime on in just a moment so you can understand the absolute scale of this thing. These are all different little vias. If anything goes wrong anywhere on this board, one component dies, you're probably not going to get it to boot whatsoever, and good luck testing and locating all of the faults, because again, you can see some of these little parts are absolutely microscopic in nature. And this GPU board marries up to the top CPU board, basically making a mating connection and making the board even bigger within its enclosure. This is the most amount of boards I've pretty much ever seen in my history arcade collecting, trying to repair arcade boards and showing you guys insanely rare hardware. It is massive, but it did its job. It made these games look absolutely spectacular for 1997. Unfortunately, the one thing that Konami failed to do is they made a board that was powerful and impressive. They had the visuals to match, and on the gameplay front, it was only decent whatsoever. It could not keep up anywhere with Sega or Namco's best arcade fighting games of the time as far as 3D is concerned. And finally, we get to one board that isn't overly complicated. This is the IO board with JVS on top. You're going to see here we just have some pins, a couple of which are bent, but for the most part this is just a JVS board, and it doesn't really have anything overly complicated to it, which is the only piece of the Konami Cobra hardware that has not been over-engineered to absolute hell. And I gotta find a manual for this thing because I have no idea what those dip switches do, and unlike every other board, this one has absolutely nothing underneath it, which is always nice to see. Now again, this runs off a hard drive. For the most part these are going to fail, but you can basically solid state them over into some other format, which is one of the nice things. It's the only part of the Konami Cobra, if it is broken, is an easy fix, and that is nice because these hard drives are old, they got beat up moving around, they've been shipped. For the most part, if you have an arcade game from the 90s that still has a working hard drive, you're going to have an arcade game from the 90s that doesn't have a working hard drive soon. And this is the power supply to power the Konami Cobra. It is an absolute massive tank. It is heavy as hell. You could absolutely drop this on your foot and break it. But it needs all of that power because think of all of the different chips on board. This thing is an absolute tank, and it is going to absolutely run up an electricity bill if you even plug the thing in. There are so many different connectors on the side of this to move power all across the Konami Cobra board because the board is just so power thirsty. This thing drinks power like I drink High Life and shots of Fernet on the weekend with friends. And you even get some fun features on the front. You can degauss the monitor. You've got a test button, 2 service buttons. You also have a volume knob and line in and line out. So this thing isn't just a power supply, it's also the test setting menu and all of those other associated functions. So there are some PCBs inside of this thing, but I am not opening up the power supply. It's really not that interesting. And you will see here on the 3.3 volt side, it has a 15 amp circuit breaker. And honestly, if you don't know about home electricity, for the most part, a single circuit is 15 amps. So this thing, to produce these level of visuals, is just absolutely gorging itself on power. It's like a fat kid that went to a Chinese buffet growing up. Maybe that was me, you never know. But it does end up working out because the visuals are outstanding. The one problem is Fighting Bujutsu just isn't the most entertaining game ever. It is a total B tier effort, and compared to something like Virtua Fighter 3 or Tekken, all of those games on arcade floors, it was fun, but it just didn't really hit. I'd much rather play something like Samurai Shodown 64 with worse visuals than something like the Cobra with Fighting Bujutsu. And as far as how many wires you need to use to set this thing up, you need that right there, plus this absolute rat's nest of other wiring and cabling. It is probably going to take me multiple hours just to build this board set back up to get to the point in time where I can actually plug it into my wall, and at that point in time it's as likely that I trip the circuit and have to rewire some stuff in my house to make it work as it is that it just absolutely lets the magic smoke out. I have not plugged this thing in yet. I've still been researching it and trying to get it fixed, and of course I still need some standoffs as well. And all of this is going to go into this massive metal box, which is going to have its own set of fuses. It's almost like Konami thought that this thing was going to get overvolted and magic smoke itself out of existence, and they tried to protect against all of that. And if you thought we were done with the wires, we are not. We still have a metric crap ton inside, as well as some fans to clean. And all of this for a board that probably still does not work whatsoever, that only technically plays 2 games, one of which I already have on the Konami NWK-TR. And this is what we call foolish, folks. Do not buy this hardware. Do not try to fix this hardware. Just go ahead and check out Fighting Bujutsu on MAME and realize that it is not in any way, shape, or form worth trying to repair this. And this technically isn't even mine. This is on loan to me to try to repair it and do some videos on. I've been trying to find a Cobra working to buy, and in the 7 years I have looked for a working Cobra board, not a single working board has appeared. It may be very likely that there is not another working board in the universe known to exist, and that is because Konami basically turned this thing into a dumpster fire. See you guys next time. Bye bye.